Paris was breathtaking from above. Golden-lit boulevards, bustling cafes, and the elegant silhouette of the Eiffel Tower against a deepening evening sky. But beneath the city, hidden far from the charm and romance, lay a different world entirely. The catacombs. Over 6 million souls rested there, their remains stacked in endless tunnels of skulls and bones. A macabre maze stretching for miles beneath the streets, where the dead outnumbered the living. And tonight, a small group of tourists was about to venture too deep. Emma adjusted the straps of her backpack, her heart thrumming with excitement as she followed the group through a narrow, unmarked alleyway in the Latin Quarter. "This is insane," Lucas muttered beside her, shoving his hands into his jacket pockets. "We could get arrested, you know. Only if we get caught." Emma smirked, glancing back at him. "Besides, Jacques does this all the time." Jacques, their Parisian guide, grinned. "Ah, but that is the thrill, non?" He was in his late 20s, with a lean build and dark, mischievous eyes. Unlike the official tours, Jacques' excursions ventured beyond the restricted areas, into the forgotten tunnels that even seasoned explorers avoided. Behind them, Sophie and Mark, an American couple they had met earlier, exchanged uncertain glances. "I thought this would be more historical," Sophie whispered. Mark wrapped an arm around her. "Relax. It's just an adventure." Jacques reached a rusted metal grate at the end of the alleyway. He knelt, producing a key from his pocket, and with a loud creak, he pulled the gate open. "Welcome," he said with a grin, "to the real catacombs." Emma peered inside. A stone staircase spiraled downward into darkness. A cold, damp air drifted up, carrying the scent of earth and something ancient. For a moment she hesitated. Then Jacques switched on his flashlight, and the tunnel glowed in eerie, flickering light. "Shall we?" And with that, he descended. The deeper they went, the colder it became. Emma ran her fingers along the rough limestone walls, tracing the centuries-old carvings of long-forgotten workers. The sound of dripping water echoed through the tunnels, giving the eerie impression that something was moving just out of sight. Jacques led them carefully, guiding them away from the well-lit tourist paths. They moved through cramped corridors, stepping over piles of human bones that had long since been abandoned in chaotic disarray. Some of these tunnels, Jacques explained, are so undisturbed, even archaeologists don't know what's down there. Lucas snorted. "Great. Just what I wanted to hear while wandering a freaking graveyard." Jacques just smiled. "Then you will love this." He gestured toward an arched doorway, half collapsed with rubble. Beyond it, an even darker passage stretched forward. "This is an unmapped section," Jacques said. "Few have entered it, and even fewer have returned." Sophie paled. "Wait, what?" Jacques laughed. I joke. But Emma saw the way his expression flickered, just for a second. Something about this tunnel unsettled him. Still, he led the way, and they followed backslash. They walked for what felt like hours, deeper into the belly of the forgotten city of the dead. The bones in this section were different. They weren't neatly stacked like in the main catacombs. They were scattered, as if something had disturbed them. A shiver crawled down Emma's spine. "Are we lost?" Lucas asked, his voice tight with unease. Jacques hesitated. "None. We are simply deeper than I have gone before." A heavy silence settled between them. Then, tap, tap, tap. A sound, barely audible, echoed through the tunnel. Emma froze. "Did you hear that?" The others stopped, their breathing suddenly shallow. Then, tap, 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 came again. A soft, deliberate tapping. Sophie clutched Mark's arm. "Jacques, what is that?" Jacques swallowed hard. "It is probably just water dripping," but Emma knew. It wasn't water. It was rhythmic, purposeful, and it was coming closer. Lucas lifted his flashlight, the beam shaking as it illuminated the next section of the tunnel. The walls were different here. Instead of stacked skulls and bones, they were carved with symbols, strange, spiraling etchings that pulsed beneath the light. And then, in the silence, something whispered, a breathless voice drifting through the tunnel. "You should not be here." Emma's blood turned to ice. Mark spun around. Who said that? No one answered. The whispering had come from everywhere and nowhere. The tapping started again, faster this time. Jacques turned sharply. We need to go. Now. Sophie clutched his sleeve. But we... Boom. A sudden, deafening noise shook the tunnel. The ground shuddered, and with a deep, echoing groan, the ceiling behind them collapsed. Dust and debris filled the air as Emma coughed, waving frantically to clear her vision. When the dust settled, she felt her stomach drop. The way back was gone. They were trapped. Panic surged through the group. Mark rushed to the rubble, desperately clawing at the rocks. We can dig through, right? Jacques was breathing hard. It will take hours. Maybe days. Sophie whimpered, hugging herself. No. Lucas ran a hand through his hair. There has to be another way. Jacques hesitated, then turned to the darker tunnel ahead. There is one, he said. Emma followed his gaze, her stomach tightening. The passage stretched into endless darkness, the air thick with cold and decay. And just beyond the light's reach, something moved. A figure, standing perfectly still, watching them, and then another, and another, emerging from the shadows. The whispers returned, rising like a distant wind. You should not be here. Emma's breath hitched, because now the voices weren't just whispers. They were right behind her. The whispers slithered through the air like unseen hands, brushing against Emma's skin. Cold, hollow, not meant for the living. She turned sharply, heart hammering. The shadows shifted, figures standing just beyond the reach of their flickering flashlight beams. Unmoving, watching. Then, in the distance, the tapping returned. Tap, tap, tap. A slow, deliberate rhythm, echoing through the maze of bones. Lucas gripped her arm. Emma, he whispered, voice barely holding steady. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to focus. They had to move. Jacques was already pulling Sophie to her feet, brushing dust from her trembling hands. Mark still stood near the collapsed tunnel, breathing heavily. There has to be another way out, Mark muttered, voice thick with panic. Right, Jacques? Jacques exhaled sharply. There are always other tunnels. But the tapping grew louder, closer. Boom, boom, boom. Not tapping anymore. Something was walking, coming for them. Jacques made a decision. This way. He didn't wait for them to argue. He grabbed his flashlight and hurried forward, deeper into the forbidden tunnels. Emma ran after him, heart pounding in her throat. The others followed, stumbling over scattered bones and uneven stones. The whispers followed too. Low voices, murmuring in a language Emma couldn't understand. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds. She risked a glance over her shoulder. The figures in the dark were moving, following them, but they weren't walking. They were drifting, a mass of shadowed forms, their hollow eye sockets gleaming faintly in the dark. The dead, awake, watching, waiting. Emma choked back a scream and ran faster. The tunnel twisted sharply, leading into a wider chamber. Emma skidded to a stop, gasping. The walls were lined with skulls, stacked in intricate, macabre patterns. Their hollow eyes stared, as if watching the intruders trespass into forbidden ground. Bones littered the floor, broken and scattered, as if someone or something had been searching for something buried beneath them. Or someone. Sophie clutched Mark's arm. What is this place? Jacques swallowed hard. This is old. Older than the catacombs. Emma turned to him. What do you mean? Jacques hesitated. The tunnels under Paris. They were used long before the catacombs were made. Some say for rituals. Mark scoffed. What kind of rituals? Jacques hesitated, but Lucas cut in before he could answer. I don't care what kind. We need to get out of here. Now. The whispers surged again. This time angry, loud. The air shifted, and the skulls on the walls began to move. The sound was faint at first, a soft scraping like stone grinding against stone. Then, clatter. A skull tumbled from the wall, hitting the ground at Emma's feet. Then another. Then all of them. The walls collapsed in a rain of bone, falling like an avalanche. Emma screamed, shielding her face as the wave of skulls surged forward, knocking her off her feet. Lucas grabbed her, yanking her back just as something pale and bony emerged from the rubble. A hand. Not a skeleton. Not fully. Something half-rotted, half-formed. A corpse, buried beneath centuries of bones, now rising. Sophie sobbed. No. No, no, no. The thing pulled itself free, its hollow face barely human. And it wasn't alone. The whispers turned to wails, and from the shifting bones, figures began crawling out. Their hollowed, decomposed faces turned toward the intruders. Emma stumbled backward, colliding with Lucas. "What do we do?" she gasped. Jacques held up his flashlight, his face pale as death. "We run." And the dead lunged. The air was thick with dust and the stench of decayed bone. Emma barely had time to process the horror before the first corpse lunged. It moved unnaturally fast, its skeletal hands reaching for her, fingers snapping open and shut like the jaws of a starving animal. "Run!" Jacques yelled. He didn't need to say it twice. Emma spun and sprinted, nearly tripping over the sea of skulls beneath her feet. Lucas grabbed her arm, keeping her upright as they tore through the narrow tunnel. Behind them, the wailing voices grew louder. The dead things were following, crawling, dragging themselves out of the mountain of bones. And they were fast. The tunnel split into 3 paths ahead. Jacques skidded to a halt, hesitating. "Which way?" Mark demanded, panting. Jacques cursed under his breath. I don't know. This isn't part of the official route." The whispers turned into screeches. Emma stole a glance behind her. Her stomach dropped. The figures were closing in, their hollow eyes glowing faintly in the dark. Some still looked human, their flesh clinging to their bodies in sickly strips. Others were bare skulls and rotting sinew, moving on nothing but pure rage. "Pick away now," Lucas shouted. Jacques chose the left tunnel and bolted. The others followed, bones crunching beneath their feet. The passage twisted sharply, the walls pressing in tighter and tighter, until Emma felt like the catacombs themselves were swallowing them whole. Then, Sophie screamed. Emma turned just in time to see one of the things grab her ankle. Sophie kicked wildly, sobbing as bony fingers wrapped around her leg. Mark lunged forward, grabbing her arm and yanking hard. "Sophie, hold on." The thing's jaw stretched open, revealing rows of jagged, broken teeth. Its hollow eye sockets locked onto Sophie as it pulled harder. She was slipping. Emma reacted without thinking. She snatched up a loose femur from the floor and swung it as hard as she could. Crack. The thing's skull caved in, and it let out an unearthly screech, releasing Sophie. Lucas and Mark yanked her back just as more hands burst from the floor, clawing at the air. They ran. This time they didn't stop. The tunnel opened suddenly into a vast chamber. Emma's breath caught. The ceiling was high and arched, like an ancient cathedral, but made entirely of bones. The walls were lined with thousands of skulls, their empty sockets staring down like silent witnesses. But the most disturbing part was the altar in the center. A massive stone slab, covered in dark stains. Emma shuddered. Those stains looked too fresh. "This isn't right," Jacques whispered. "This place shouldn't be here." Mark shone his flashlight over the walls. "What the hell is this?" Jacques didn't answer, because suddenly the whispers stopped. Silence. The air grew thick, heavy. Emma felt something watching them, and then, a low, rattling breath came from the darkness. Lucas swung his flashlight toward the sound, and froze. Something stood at the far end of the chamber. Not one of the crawling corpses. Something worse. It was tall, its body wrapped in rotting burial cloths, like an ancient mummy. Its face was hidden, but its eyes. Emma's stomach twisted. Its eyes were open, but they weren't human. They glowed. A deep, sickly red, like burning coals buried in a skull. Tilted its head, watching them. Then, in a voice that wasn't a voice, it spoke. "You should not have come." The words weren't spoken aloud. They hummed through the air, pressing against Emma's skull like an unbearable weight. You should not have come. Her body locked up. The thing in the burial cloth stood motionless, its burning red eyes fixed on them. The glow pulsed, as if breathing. Nobody moved. Nobody could move. Then, the bones on the altar shifted. Sophie gasped as a thin, skeletal arm pushed its way through the pile, clawing at the stone. Another hand emerged, dragging something half-rotted into the dim light. Mark let out a sharp breath. We have to go." Jacques shook his head violently, like he was trying to clear static from his mind. That's not a person. That's not." The thing on the altar sat up. Its head snapped toward them, jaw hanging too wide, like it had been broken in death. And then, it screamed. The spell broke. Lucas grabbed Emma's arm and yanked her backward just as the screaming corpse lunged. The others scattered. Mark pulled Sophie, Jacques stumbled, but they all ran toward the nearest exit, a narrow tunnel at the far end of the chamber. The thing on the altar was crawling after them, its body bending in ways a human body shouldn't. And behind it, the watcher turned slowly, its glowing eyes locking onto their retreating forms. It raised one bony hand. The walls shook. The skulls lining the chamber split open, and hundreds of shadowy figures poured out, pulling themselves from the walls like ghosts peeling free of their own graves. Emma ran faster. The tunnel twisted downward, the air growing colder and wetter. Mark swore. "We're going deeper." "No choice," Jacques snapped. Behind them, the echoing shrieks filled the passage, bouncing off the walls, distorting into something inhuman. Emma's breath burned in her throat. The ground beneath them was turning to muddy stone, slick and uneven. Then, Lucas skidded to a stop. "Wait!" Emma nearly slammed into him. A sheer drop loomed in front of them. Pit. The tunnel ended in a jagged opening, leading into a black void. Emma's heart hammered. "How deep?" Sophie whispered. Lucas tossed a loose rock over the edge. It fell, and kept falling. No sound. No bottom. "We have to jump," Jacques said. Sophie whipped toward him. "Are you insane?" "Staying means death," he shot back. Or worse. The screeching behind them grew louder. The shadowy figures were almost here. Lucas clenched his jaw. Jumping into the unknown, or getting torn apart. Terrible choice. Emma took a shaky breath. And then, she jumped. Emma's stomach lurched as she plunged into the darkness. The wind howled past her ears, a deafening rush of air that swallowed her scream. She had no idea how far she was falling. No ground, no bottom, just an endless void below. Then, her body slammed into ice-cold water. The impact knocked the air from her lungs. The water was like liquid shadow, thick and unnatural. She kicked wildly, panic flaring in her chest. Above her, muffled splashes echoed as the others plummeted after her. Lucas, Sophie, Mark, Jacques, all of them sinking into the abyss. Then, a hand wrapped around Emma's ankle. She choked on a scream, bubbles escaping into the dark water. The grip tightened, pulling her down. Something was beneath them, something alive. The water pulsed and suddenly, a face appeared, pale, hollow, eyeless sockets staring right at her. Emma thrashed, kicking hard. The thing's grip loosened just enough for her to pull free. She twisted upward, kicking toward the surface. Her head broke through just as Sophie screamed. Emma spun around. Sophie was struggling, something unseen pulling her under. Lucas and Jacques reached for her, gripping her arms. "Hold on!" Sophie gasped, her face contorted in terror. It's hands. So many hands. Then, she was yanked beneath the water. "No!" Mark dove after her. Lucas swore. "Damn it!" He took a deep breath and went under. Emma followed, heart hammering. The water was black and endless. Shapes moved below them. Dozens. Hundreds. Bodies. Floating like they had been trapped here for centuries. Their hands reached blindly, mouths open in silent screams. Sophie was thrashing wildly, trying to fight off the hands dragging her deeper. Emma swam hard, reaching for her. Her fingers brushed Sophie's wrist. Then, a shadow shifted beneath them, Something huge was moving below, and it was waking up. A deep, throbbing vibration shook the water. It wasn't sound, it was something older, something that pulsed in their bones. Then Emma saw it. Far below them, hidden in the abyss, a colossal shape shifting like a sleeping titan. It wasn't a single entity. It was a mass of bodies, all woven together, their limbs intertwined, their faces merged into one nightmarish form. And it was rising. Emma's lungs burned. She grabbed Sophie with both hands, yanking her toward the surface. Lucas and Mark were kicking upward, dragging Sophie between them. The shadows below surged. Hands reached for them, clawing at their legs, their clothes. Then, they broke the surface, gasping for air. Emma kicked backward, scanning their surroundings. They were in a vast underground cavern, the ceiling lost in the shadows above. The water stretched out endlessly with no sign of land. But something was changing. The water was moving, and it was pulling them toward something. A faint glow shimmered in the distance. A rocky shore lined with jagged stones. The current, Jacques panted. It's dragging us toward the shore. Emma turned and froze. The watcher was standing at the water's edge, waiting. Its red eyes gleamed in the darkness, fixed on them with inhuman patience. And as they drifted closer, it raised one skeletal hand. Emma's body locked up. They weren't escaping. They were being led deeper, deeper into the realm of the dead. Emma's body trembled as the current pushed them toward shore. The watcher stood motionless, its elongated form draped in a tattered black robe. Its red eyes burned like embers, locked onto them as if measuring their worth. Lucas coughed violently, pulling Sophie alongside him. We have to get out of this water. Now, the water was too still, unnaturally so. As Emma treaded, she realized something. It wasn't the current pulling them in. It was the water itself. Something beneath the surface was guiding them. They reached the jagged shore, the stones slick with something dark. Emma pulled herself onto the rocky ground, her fingers scraping across the sharp edges of bone buried beneath the surface. Not rocks, bones. The entire shoreline was made of them. Mark collapsed beside her, shaking. Jesus, what the hell is this place? Jacques stood slowly, his face pale. The burial chambers, he whispered. It is deeper than any map shows. No one has been here in centuries. Emma looked around. The cavern stretched into endless darkness, with twisted archways carved into the rock. Strange symbols had been scratched into the walls, some familiar, some impossible to understand. And then, a sound, a whisper, coming from the watcher. The figure did not move, but the air around them seemed to vibrate with its voice. Turn back if you still can. The voice was ancient, layered, like 1,000 voices speaking as one. Emma's chest tightened. Who are you? The watcher tilted its head, the shadows beneath its hood writhing like living things. I am the guardian of the gate, the keeper of the forgotten. You were not meant to come here. Lucas clenched his fists. We don't want to be here. Just tell us how to get out. A silence fell. Then, there is only one way out. The watcher lifted a bony hand, pointing toward a massive stone doorway in the distance. A gate made of human skulls. Emma's stomach turned. Sophie shook her head. I don't like this. Mark exhaled sharply. What's on the other side? The watcher's red eyes glowed brighter. The path of the dead. The group approached the gate of skulls, their footsteps echoing in the silence. The closer they got, the more Emma felt it. A presence, something waiting on the other side. A massive archway of bones towered above them, fused together in a grotesque pattern. A thick mist seeped through the cracks, curling along the ground like skeletal fingers. Jacques hesitated. I have read of this. Legends say the dead were buried here with no names, no memories. Forgotten by the world above. Emma's breath hitched. Then what's behind the gate? Jacques swallowed. The ones who never left. Sophie whimpered. We can't go in there. Lucas ran a hand through his soaked hair. We don't have a choice. Emma stepped forward, gripping the edge of the skull gate. The moment she touched it, a whisper crawled through her mind. Emma, Her entire body froze. That voice. It was her mother's voice. Emma's vision blurred. Her mother had died when she was 6 years old. It was impossible. But there it was. Emma, why did you leave me? The whispers grew louder. Mark gasped. I hear my grandfather. He's calling my name. Sophie's eyes widened. My sister. She drowned when we were kids. I hear her. They were not alone. The dead were waiting for them. A deep grinding noise shook the cavern. The gates slowly creaked open, revealing an endless corridor of black stone. The mist rolled in waves, twisting into faint figures, shadows of the past. Lucas turned to the Watcher. What happens if we go through? The Watcher remained still. You will see what should remain unseen. Emma's pulse pounded in her ears. There was no way back. Taking a deep breath, she stepped forward. Into the darkness. The air inside the tunnel was thick, suffocating, as if the very walls were alive, pressing in on them. A heavy mist curled around their legs, moving unnaturally, almost like it was watching them. Emma took a shaky step forward, her heart hammering in her chest. The whispers hadn't stopped. They slithered through the corridor, echoing from the black stone walls, their voices filled with longing, anger, and sorrow. Emma, come back to me. She clenched her fists, trying to shake off the sound. It wasn't real. Couldn't be real. Mark walked beside her, his face pale. This place is wrong. I can feel it. Sophie clutched Lucas's arm, her breath short and shallow. We need to keep moving. Jacques, at the back, trailed his fingers along the stone. His voice was hushed. This passage, it should not exist. There are no maps, no records. It is as if it was. Emma turned to him. As if what? Jacques hesitated. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, as if it was never meant to be found, they walked in silence, each footstep swallowed by the black mist. The deeper they went, the more the passage seemed to shift, the walls stretching endlessly, as if they were walking through a space that didn't obey natural rules. Then, a movement in the mist. Emma froze. Did you see that? Lucas turned. See what? She pointed ahead. The mist was shifting, taking shape, solidifying into something human-like. A shadow, tall, thin, its face obscured by the fog. It stood completely still, watching them, and then took a step forward. Sophie let out a sharp gasp. Mark grabbed Emma's arm. We need to move. Now! They broke into a run, their footsteps echoing through the endless passage. The walls seemed to close in, twisting unnaturally, as if the path itself was changing around them. Jacques swore under his breath. This place is not a tunnel. It is a labyrinth. Emma's lungs burned as she ran. What happens if we take the wrong path? No one answered. They turned a corner and stopped dead. A wall of skulls blocked their path. Hollow eye sockets stared at them, silent and accusing. Lucas whipped around. No, no, no. This wasn't here before. The whispering grew louder. Why did you leave us? Come back, join us. Emma turned back toward the tunnel, and the shadow was standing there, closer, waiting. Jacques grabbed Sophie's arm. Look, over there, just to their right, half hidden by the mist, was an ancient stone door, covered in symbols and handprints, smeared with something dark. Blood. We have no choice, Emma whispered. The whispers surged, their voices overlapping. The shadow took another step. Lucas grabbed the stone slab and heaved. The door groaned, dust falling from its edges as it slowly slid open. The second it cracked wide enough, they rushed inside. Jacques pushed the door shut just as the shadow lunged forward. The last thing Emma saw was its outstretched fingers before the door slammed shut. The whispers stopped. Everything was silent. Emma's breaths came in short gasps. They had made it through. But where were they now? The room was enormous, an underground chamber, far larger than anything they had seen before. The walls were covered in ancient carvings, spirals and symbols glowing faintly in the dim light. The floor was lined with stone slabs. Graves. Sophie swallowed hard. This is a burial chamber. Emma stepped forward, her fingers brushing against the markings. But who was buried here? Jacques moved toward the center of the room, his eyes scanning the inscriptions. His face paled. This is not just a burial site. Lucas frowned. Then what is it? Jacques turned, his voice hollow. A prison. A deep groan rumbled through the chamber, shaking the air. Something shifted beneath them. The stone slabs began to move. One by one, they slid open. Emma's stomach twisted as the first bony fingers curled over the edges of the graves. Sophie let out a choked scream. Oh my God! The dead were waking up. And they were not alone. Emma's breath caught in her throat as the stone slabs slid open, revealing rotting hands reaching out from the darkness. The air turned putrid, thick with decay. Shadows moved unnaturally along the walls, flickering in the dim torchlight. Sophie screamed, stumbling backward as a skeletal figure pulled itself free from its grave, empty eye sockets glowing with a dull, unnatural light. We need to get out now, Mark shouted, grabbing Sophie's wrist. Lucas turned to Jacques. Where do we go? Jacques' face was pale, his mouth open in horror. There is no exit. This room was not meant to be opened. Emma's pulse pounded in her ears. The dead figures, dozens of them, dragged themselves from their stone prisons, their movements unnatural, jerky, like puppets controlled by invisible strings. The whispering had stopped, replaced by the sound of bones grinding against stone. And then, a voice, cold, ancient, hungry. You were warned. Emma spun around, searching for the source of the voice. It didn't come from the dead. It came from the walls themselves. The carvings on the stone glowed brighter, as if something was waking up beneath them. Jacques stumbled forward, his hands shaking. This isn't just a burial site. It's a seal, a barrier between the world of the living and them. Lucas grabbed him by the shoulders. Then how do we fix it? Jacques hesitated. We must close the gate before the others wake up. Emma's gaze shot back to the stone slabs. More figures were crawling free, their mouths opening in silent screams. If they didn't act fast, they'd be overwhelmed. She turned, her eyes locking on an archway at the far end of the chamber. Unlike the rough-hewn walls, this was different, older, smoother, covered in intricate symbols. At its center, a massive stone disc was embedded into the wall, its edges lined with carvings of human figures in agony. Jacques followed her gaze. His face went white. The gate of the damned, he whispered. Mark tightened his grip on Sophie's hand. Then we need to shut it. The figures in the chamber were moving faster now, no longer sluggish. Their bones cracked as they turned their heads in unison, their sockets locked onto the group. And then, the ground shook. The torches flickered wildly as a deep, guttural growl echoed from the darkness. The dead froze, as if something far worse had just arrived. And then it stepped forward. The creature wasn't human. It was twice the size of a man, its body wrapped in decayed ceremonial robes, its skull-like face twisted in a grotesque grin. 2 empty sockets burned with green fire, and when it moved, its bones creaked like ancient wood. You have broken the seal, the voice whispered, though the creature's mouth did not move. Now you must take their place. Emma's stomach twisted. No, we're leaving. The creature tilted its head. You do not leave the catacombs. You become them. The guardian lunged. Emma dove to the side as its massive arm swung down, slamming into the ground with a sickening crack. Stone splintered, sending shards flying through the chamber. Go! Go! Lucas shouted. They ran toward the archway, dodging between the rising dead. The shadows shifted, reaching for them with long, inky fingers. Sophie screamed as one of the figures grabbed her ankle, its jaw unhinging to reveal rows of jagged teeth. Mark ripped her free, pulling her forward. Jacques reached the gate first, his hands skimming over the carvings. There has to be a way. A mechanism. The guardian roared, its voice shaking the entire chamber. Emma's eyes darted frantically over the stone disc. The figures carved into it. They weren't just ornaments. They were holding something. She pressed her hands against the center of the disc. Nothing. Her mind raced. What was missing? Then she realized. Blood. Her hands were already bleeding from the stone shards. Heart pounding, she pressed her palm to the symbols. The moment her blood touched the carvings, the stone rumbled. The gate of the damned began to move. The guardian let out a horrific wail, its form distorting, the fire in its sockets flickering wildly. The dead staggered, their bodies jerking unnaturally, as if they were being pulled backward. Jacques turned, eyes wide. It's working. The archway trembled, the carvings glowing brighter. But the guardian wasn't done yet. Charged forward, its claws raised. Emma braced herself, and Jacques shoved her aside. The guardian's hand speared through his chest, lifting him off the ground. No! Sophie screamed. Jacques coughed, blood spilling from his lips. He turned his gaze to Emma. Finish it, he choked. With his last breath, Jacques slammed his bloody hand against the stone. The gate burst to life. A massive shockwave erupted from the archway, sweeping through the chamber like a tidal wave of fire. The guardian screamed, its form breaking apart, dissolving into nothingness. The dead were ripped backward, dragged into the dark abyss beyond the gate. And then, the stone slammed shut. Silence. Emma collapsed, gasping for breath. Jacques' body lay still. Sophie was crying, her hands shaking. Lucas stood beside her, his face pale. Mark turned, looking around. The chamber was empty now. No dead, no guardian, just the whispers of the past, fading into nothing. Emma swallowed hard. We need to go. There, at the far end of the room, a narrow tunnel led upward, toward daylight. One by one, they made their way toward the final passage. As Emma reached the entrance, she turned one last time. The catacombs were silent again. The dead were at rest. And the gate would never open again. The news report was brief, for survivors were found near the entrance of the Paris Catacombs early this morning. Authorities believe they were part of an illegal tour that went horribly wrong. One man remains missing, Jacques Moreau, a historian and guide. His body was never found. Emma listened in silence, staring at the TV screen. She knew the truth. Jacques wasn't missing. He was down there. And somewhere, deep beneath the city, a whisper still echoed in the dark. You were warned.